The story begins inside a royal palace, where a young boy named Van suddenly wakes up in a large, luxurious bed. When he raises his hands, he is immediately confused. His hands are small, thin, and clearly not those of an adult. At the same time, memories from another life begin to surface. He remembers living in Japan, spending his days packed into crowded trains, working endlessly, and returning home exhausted every night. His life back then was repetitive and empty. Realizing what has happened, Van understands that he has been reincarnated into another world. Van climbs out of bed and uses a small stool to look out the window. Outside, he sees wide land, tall buildings, and a peaceful sky. Before he can enjoy the view for long, his maid, Till, rushes in and panics, warning him that it is dangerous. When Van calmly apologizes using clear and polite words, Till freezes in shock. Van is supposed to be only 2 years old. Hearing himself speak, Van realizes that along with memories from his past life, he also has memories from this world. His name is Van Ne Ferdio, son of Marquis Jalpa Ferdio, ruler of this land. Later, Van sits down for breakfast with his father and brothers. The atmosphere is stiff and quiet. Jalpa asks his sons what they plan to study that day. Jard says he will focus on fire magic and battle formations, while Sesto says he will study magic. When Jalpa turns to Van, Van answers honestly, saying he wants to learn the nation's history and culture first. His answer shocks his brothers, but Jalpa laughs and praises Van's intelligence. He confidently states that Van will inherit powerful fire magic, just like his parents, and tells him to look forward to his magical aptitude test when he turns 8. Van soon learns that magic determines a person's value in this world. Fire, water, wind, and earth are considered noble elements, while all other magic types are treated as useless. After breakfast, Van begins studying the world's structure, races, and magic tools. However, things become intense when the strict head butler Espada takes over his education. Espada pushes Van into merciless study sessions from morning until night. Thanks to this harsh training, Van learns to read and write within weeks, though he often wonders how this is considered normal for a toddler. After 2 years of non-stop studying, Van turns 4 and begins sword training. At first, he is completely hopeless and loses repeatedly, even to the maids. Still, he refuses to quit and continues practicing every day. By the time he turns 5, his effort pays off. He starts defeating older trainees with ease, thanks to his calm thinking and experience from his past life. Unlike his brothers, Van treats commoners kindly, which earns him respect and friendship. During training, the deputy knight commander D examines Van's hands and notices that they lack calluses. He realizes that Van spends more time studying than training. D offers to speak to Espada, but instead decides to personally train Van himself. Unfortunately, D's idea of training is extreme, pushing Van to his physical limits with no mercy. Still, Van cannot deny that despite the pain, he feels fulfilled for the first time in his life. By the time Van turns 6, the endless routine of studying and training becomes exhausting. Wanting to actually enjoy life, Van decides to act like a normal child and asked to visit the market. The market is lively and full of people, and Van is fascinated by everything he sees. While exploring, he witnesses a shocking scene, a man selling his own son into slavery. Van learns that poor families often sell children they cannot support. When the man becomes violent after learning his son is worth very little, Van steps in and buys the boy for 5 silver coins. Van never planned to own him and told him he is free. However, since Kamsin has nowhere to go, Van registers him as his slave so he can safely bring him home. A slave contract is formed, leaving a mark on Kamsin's hand. Time passes, and Van finally reaches 8 years old, the age when magical aptitude is tested. Everyone expects him to awaken powerful elemental magic. Instead, the result leaves everyone stunned. Van possesses production magic, a type considered worthless. Furious, Jalpa nearly kill him on the spot. At the last moment, Van's eldest brother, Mercia, intervenes and suggests sending Van to govern a remote village instead. Jalpa agrees and orders Van to leave immediately. Though cast aside, Van feels hopeful about starting a new life. However, his hope quickly fades when Espada and Dee announce that they will accompany him. Van continues his journey toward his assigned territory in a carriage. To pass the time, he decides to experiment with his production magic. Concentrating his mana, he creates a small sword out of thin air. The process goes smoothly, showing that he already has excellent control over his magic. Kamsin watches quietly and is not surprised, as he already knows Vaughn learns incredibly fast. During the ride, Vaughn brings up an important issue. Since he has been disowned by his family and lost his noble status, he tells Kamsin that there is no longer any reason for him to remain a slave. Vaughn offers to cancel the slave contract and help him live freely. However, Kamsin immediately refuses. He firmly declares that his life now belongs to Vaughn and that he will follow him wherever he goes. Vaughn is troubled by how serious Kamsin is, but accepts his decision. Suddenly, the carriage stops. Looking ahead, they see a village under attack. Dee quickly evaluates the situation and estimates around 50 enemies, likely bandits. He suggests attacking immediately. However, the adventurer Ortho objects, reminding everyone that their contract is only to escort Vaughn, not fight a full battle. Dee becomes angry and insists he cannot abandon innocent villagers. Even if no one helps him, he is ready to fight alone. Before things escalate, Espada intervenes and bluntly calls Dee's plan reckless. Instead, Espada proposes a strategy using a defensive wall, ranged attacks, and a surprise flank assault. Vaughn immediately notices the flaw in the plan. Espada would have to act as bait, putting his life at risk. Understanding how important Espada and Dee are to the future of the territory, Vaughn volunteers to take the role himself. Till and Kamsin panic and strongly object, but Vaughn calmly insists. He reminds them that he trained with the sword for years and believes this is something he must do. Vaughn's resolve deeply affects Ortho, who recalled how politely Vaughn thanked him earlier. Realizing Vaughn is different from other nobles, Ortho steps forward and refuses to let a child risk his life. With that, the plan is revised. Espada raises the defensive wall, adventurers fire arrows from behind it, and Dee and Ortho's forces launch a coordinated attack from both sides. The bandits fall into chaos. During the battle, the bandit leader breaks through and charges towards the wall, but Vaughn steps in and slashes his Achilles tendon. Kamsin immediately finishes the fight. The remaining bandits are captured and the village is saved, without civilian casualties. After the battle, most adventurers leave, but Ortho and his party decide to stay behind, impressed by Vaughn's leadership and calm judgment. Vaughn then formally introduces himself to the village chief, Rhonda, as their new lord. Rhonda explains that the village has suffered repeated attacks ever since night patrols stopped coming. Vaughn apologizes for the neglect and promises to protect them. He presents 3 possible plans: creating valuable goods, hiring mercenaries, or strengthening the village's defenses. The villagers are unsure until Espada and Dee introduce themselves and reveal their positions. Hearing this greatly boosts morale. Vaughn then shocks everyone by lowering the tax rate from 30% to 10%, prioritizing stability over profit. Espada constructs a temporary defensive wall, while the knights begin preparing a moat and traps. Vaughn tests his production magic again, creating incredibly durable wooden blocks that cannot be damaged even by Ortho's sword. He continues producing weapons effortlessly and gifts Kamsin a sword, which Kamsin accepts with great gratitude. That night, Vaughn notices everyone is exhausted from sleeping outdoors. Deciding that proper living conditions come first, he resolves to build a house. The next morning, Vaughn analyzes the land and activates his production magic. In an instant, a massive mansion rises from the ground. Everyone is left completely speechless, as Vaughn calmly wonders if he might have made it a little too big.
Villagers still struggling to believe what they just witnessed. Van's production magic has already transformed the village, and Till is clearly excited, while Kamsin points out that this kind of magic is actually more suitable for a feudal lord than the 4 elemental magics. Van finds this interesting, but he admits that he still prefers offensive magic because it allows him to directly protect his people. When he asks whether they wouldn't feel safer under a lord like that, both Till and Compson immediately disagree. They say they would rather live under Van than under his father any day, which makes Van happy, even though he knows they might be biased. Espada then gives his own opinion. He explains that during wartime, Van's thinking would be correct, since defense is everything. But in peaceful times, people want a lord who improves their daily lives. In that sense, no one understands the villagers better than Van. Everyone agrees that Van's production magic is not only powerful, but also kind. Van then casually tells everyone that if they bring wood, he can build houses for them too. This shocks the adventurers and knights, who immediately rush off to gather materials. Soon after, the villagers also ask if their homes can be rebuilt, since their current homes are old, leaky, and barely standing. Van realizes rebuilding everything at once will be exhausting, but after seeing their living conditions, he decides to renovate the entire village first. Before long, the village is completely transformed. Old houses are replaced with clean, sturdy new ones, arranged in neat blocks with proper roads between them. Van intentionally makes all the houses identical to avoid inequality. The villagers are deeply grateful and bring him gifts in return. Van even builds simple public baths next to his mansion, mostly because he wants to bathe himself, but everyone ends up loving them. Water and heat are supplied using magic, and while some awkward moments almost happen, Van keeps things respectful. That night, Van finally relaxes after a long day. That night, Lady Panamera travels in a carriage with Arit, a small girl. Panamera gently teases and comforts her as they head toward a remote village. Soon after, work continues on strengthening the village defenses. A moat is completed, and Van suggests filling it with water for both defense and daily use. Espada diverts water from a nearby river, while the knights and soldiers help dig and reinforce the structure. Thanks to teamwork, the entire project is finished far faster than expected. The villagers celebrate as clean water finally flows into the village. Van doesn't stop there. He later orders the construction of a large wall surrounding the village, using fused earth and stone to create something as strong as concrete. He also installs defensive crossbows along the walls. What was once a poor settlement has now become a small fortress that bandits could never breach. While discussing the future, Espada reminds Van that defense alone isn't enough. The village needs steady income. Merchants only visit once a month, and food resources are limited. They begin brainstorming ideas for export goods, but most options are rejected because only Van can produce them. Later, Van learns that nearby mountains contain valuable minerals like iron, silver, gold, and even rare materials. This raises the possibility of a dungeon nearby, which could completely change the village's future. However, they decide to wait until the village is more stable before announcing anything. Van continues helping adventurers by crafting high-quality weapons from refined materials, shocking everyone with the speed and precision of his magic production. Despite using massive amounts of mana, Van shows no signs of magical exhaustion, though he admits his body still gets physically tired. Just as things seem calm, an alarm rings out. Armored lizard monsters are approaching the village. Van immediately orders the gates closed and the bridge raised. Seeing the fear on everyone's faces, Van steps forward and speaks clearly. He tells them that this fight will be dangerous and they could get hurt, but he will fight alongside them. However, he can't protect the village alone, and he asks everyone to stand with him. The villagers listen closely, realizing that their young lord is ready to risk his life for them.
Van, standing before the villagers as danger approaches, he tells everyone that he's ready to fight, but he cannot protect the village alone. He asks the villagers to lend him their strength so they can defend their home together. Moved by his words, the villagers agree and rush to the walls, preparing the defenses. Van learns that Ortho's party is away hunting, so someone must take command on the wall. When Till grabs Van's arm in fear, he decides to stay behind and issue orders from below. He sends Dee to the ramparts to report the situation in real time.
As soon as Dee reaches the wall, he's shocked to see around 40 armored lizards marching toward the village. Each monster is nearly 8 meters tall, and even veteran knights struggled to defeat just one. Following Van's orders, Dee commands the villagers to load iron bolts into the ballistae. Although everyone doubts the weapons will work, Dee decides to trust Van. When they fire, the bolts punch straight through the lizards, dropping 10 of them instantly. The villagers cheer, but the joy is long-lived as they realize they only have one iron bolt left per ballista. They fire a second volley and take down more monsters, but half of the lizards are still standing and they are now out of iron bolts. As panic spreads, Van quickly thinks of another option. He remembers how a wooden sword once cut through powerful defenses and tells Dee to use wooden bolts instead. The knights protest, but Dee silences them and once again trusts Van's judgment. The wooden bolts pierce into the lizards' bodies, getting stuck halfway, but that is enough to destroy their vital organs. Realizing they can still fight, Dee orders everyone to keep firing. The remaining armored lizards are wiped out completely, and the village wins without a single injury. Dee reports the victory to Van, and the villagers celebrate loudly, amazed that even wooden weapons worked. After the battle, Ortho's party returns and helps process the lizard corpses. They collect valuable materials like eyes, fangs, skins, and magic cores, while the meat is prepared for food. Thanks to Van's specially made knives, the work goes much faster than usual. Seeing the massive amount of meat, Van declares that the village will hold a grand feast. That night, everyone celebrates, eating and drinking together. Ortho's party praises the weapons Van made for them, and the knights grow jealous, asking Van to craft weapons for them as well. Van politely refuses payment and promises to help once the village's affairs are settled. Ortho explains that each armored lizard can sell for a good amount of gold, but Van is shocked to learn that half of their earnings must be paid as tax once they exceed a certain amount. Even worse, if his father learns how valuable the village has become, Van may be exiled again. Espada suggests reporting the victory under Van's older brother's name, allowing them to stay under the radar. Van agrees, relieved. The next day, 2 merchants arrive and are stunned by the fortress-like village and the massive stock of monster materials. Van sells them the goods and even gives them meat for free before it spoils. He also shows them his weapons, which impress the merchants so much that they agree to sell them at full price. Instead of letting them monopolize the trade, Van suggests they open a shop directly in the village, and he builds it instantly, leaving them speechless. Soon after, Van receives unexpected visitors from a neighboring county, a noble girl named Arte and her guardian, Panamera, a powerful knight who has risen to Viscountess. Panamera bluntly states that she is here to judge whether Van is truly a genius or a threat. Van calmly explains his situation, claiming he was exiled and has no interest in war. Panamera doubts him, suspecting a hidden military force, but Van clears the misunderstanding with help from Dee, Espada, and Till, each explaining why they chose to stay with him. To prove the truth, Van demonstrates his production magic by instantly transforming a simple earthen wall into a fortress-grade structure. Panamera and Arte are stunned when they learn this so-called useless magic is the reason Van was exiled. Then Panamera reveals her true mission, offering Arte's hand in marriage to Van to prevent future conflict. Van gently refuses, saying he only wants a peaceful life. After witnessing his character and ability, Panamera changes her mind and openly supports the idea of marriage, even praising Van's intelligence and leadership. Arte, however, shyly admits she is not ready for such a decision yet, and Van agrees to give her time. The guests decide to stay the night, forcing Van to quickly build an inn for them to dinner. During dinner, Van and Arte talk quietly, discovering shared interests, and Arte begins to feel comfortable around him. Later, Arte thanks Van for his kindness and admits she feels relieved after meeting him. Van, realizing that Arte may share a past similar to his own, he decides that regardless of marriage, he will let her stay in the village if she wishes and live freely on her own terms. And that's how episode 4 comes to an end. Subscribe to Recapsama for more anime recaps like this one.